All right, so today we are diving deep into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck,
Ah,
which,
okay.
I got to say, the title alone, it's a bit provocative.
It grabs you, doesn't it?
Definitely grabs your attention.
Yeah.
But before anyone gets the wrong idea and thinks we're endorsing, like, total apathy, let's be clear. This book is not about just saying screw it to everything.
Right. It's not about becoming totally indifferent. It's about being choosy, intentional, about what really gets to you.
Exactly. It's like we only have so much energy,
Right.
right? So this is about figuring out what actually deserves our attention and what we can just let go of.
Absolutely. And Manson, he sets the stage for this whole approach in a really interesting way by introducing us to, well, Charles Bukowski.
Bukowski, yeah. Now, he wasn't exactly known for being a self-help guru.
Not your typical self-improvement icon, that's for sure.
No, not at all. More like the opposite, actually. Bukowski was, well, let's just say he embraced being a rough around the edges kind of guy.
Yeah.
Struggling writer, heavy drinker.
Yeah.
He owned that loser label. And
And
yet,
he found success.
he did.
His writing, it was raw, honest, talked about life's struggles, the stuff people often shy away from.
Yeah, no sugarcoating there.
And people connected with it. It resonated, which I think says a lot about this whole facade of perfection we often see.
Totally. It's like we're so bombarded with this idea of success that looks a certain way, but Bukowski's story kind of throws that out the window.
It challenges the conventional narrative, that's for sure.
It does. And what's even more interesting is his epitaph, don't try. Talk about a counterintuitive message.
Right. In a world obsessed with achievement, with hustling, that just stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? Makes you think.
It does. Like, is he saying we should just give up on everything? Embrace being screw-ups?
Well, not quite. And that's what Manson wants us to unpack. See, Bukowski's life, it becomes this starting point to question what we consider success, what we're really striving for.
So we're not supposed to try. I'm a little lost now, to be honest.
It's not about literally not trying. Think of it as a challenge to examine the things we put so much effort into. Are those things actually important to us? Or are we just going through the motions, chasing some external idea of what our lives should look like?
Okay, that makes more sense. Like, are we living for ourselves or are we trying to live up to someone else's expectations? And that constant pressure to be more, do more, achieve more, it's exhausting.
It is. And it's everywhere, especially with social media these days.
Ugh, don't even get me started on social media. It's like everyone's highlight reel on constant loop. Makes you feel like you're the only one not living your best life 24/7.
Exactly. Which brings us to Manson's concept of the feedback loop from hell.
Oh boy, the feedback loop from hell. Yeah, I can already relate.
Right. Think about it. You get anxious about an upcoming presentation,
Been there.
and then you start getting anxious about being
My
anxious.
God, yes. It's like a spiral.
Exactly. And this loop, it can apply to so many things. Anger, insecurity, you name it. It's self-sabotaging. And it thrives on that comparison game social media fuels.
Okay, so how do we break free from this loop? Because honestly, I'm ready to jump off that hamster wheel.
Well, that's where not giving effect comes in. But, and this is crucial, it's not about becoming indifferent to everything. It's about choosing your battles.
Choosing your battles, okay.
Yeah.
So not apathy, more like selective caring.
Exactly. It's about figuring out what truly matters to you based on your values and letting go of the rest. And to help us visualize this, Manson introduces us to this, well, let's just say a memorable character. Disappointment Panda.
Disappointment Panda. Okay, now I'm intrigued.
Right. Just picture a panda, tiny t-shirt, and he's all about tough love. His message is basically this. Problems? Yeah, they're going to happen. Life is full of them. Happiness isn't about avoiding problems altogether. It's about learning to solve the right ones.
So accepting that challenges are part of the deal, but we get to decide which ones are worth our energy. Kind of like choosing which problems get our effect.
Precisely. It's about defining what matters most to you, what's worth your time and energy, and then focusing on those good problems, as Manson calls them.
This whole choosing your problems thing, it really hits home for me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like I remember this time I was convinced I needed to learn how to code.
Coding.
Yeah, coding. It felt like everyone and their grandma was doing it, you know?
Right.
And I was like, if I don't get on this coding train, I'm going to be left behind.
The fear of missing out, the FOMO.
Exactly. So I'm talking months of stressing over it, online courses, the whole shebang.
Wow.
And you want to know the kicker?
What's that?
I hated every single minute of it.
It happens. We get so caught up in what we should be doing, what everyone else is doing, that we forget to ask ourselves, do I actually even want this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It took me way too long to admit that coding just wasn't my jam. Like,
Yeah.
it was such a relief to finally be like, okay, you know what? This is not for me. I'm going to focus on things I actually enjoy.
And that's huge. Giving yourself permission to quit something that's not working, even if it goes against the grain.
It's like, who am I trying to impress anyway?
Right. And speaking of things we think we should be doing, Manson talks about how the metrics we use to measure our lives can really mess with us.
Oh, totally. It's like you can be objectively successful, the house, the car, the career,
Yeah.
but still feel like a total failure inside.
Absolutely. And he illustrates this with the story of Dave Mustaine.
Dave Mustaine, the musician.
Yeah, the guitarist who was actually kicked out of Metallica right before they hit it big.
Ouch. That's got to sting.
Right. Talk about a tough break. But the thing is, even though Mustaine went on to form Megadeth...
Which is a hugely successful band.
Exactly. But even with that success, he constantly measured himself against Metallica.
Really? Even after all those years?
Oh, yeah. Like, decades later, he'd still talk about feeling like a failure because he wasn't as rich or famous as his former bandmates.
That's kind of sad, actually. I mean, the guy achieved incredible success in his own right, but he was using the wrong yardstick.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of what Manson calls choosing the wrong problems to give a feck about.
Wow. So how do we choose the right problems then?
Well, Manson contrasts Mustaine with another musician, Pete Best.
Pete Best, who?
He was the drummer for the Beatles.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, but he got fired right before they, became the Beatles.
Oh man, I'd be kicking myself if I were him. Talk about bad timing.
Right, you'd think so. But here's the thing. Best, he was devastated at first, obviously, but he eventually redefined his values. He focused on his family, found happiness in a different way.
That's amazing. Like, he took this major setback and turned it into an opportunity to create a more fulfilling life on his own terms.
Exactly, and that's a powerful lesson for all of us. It's not about comparing ourselves to some external measure of success, but about defining what truly matters to us and building a life that aligns with that.
It's about choosing our own metrics for happiness, not letting someone else's definition rule our lives.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have a choice. We can choose to focus on what we lack, or we can choose to appreciate what we have.
It's so easy to get caught in that comparison trap, though, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere. Social media, advertising, even just casual conversations.
It's like this constant message of, you need more, do more, be more, but no one ever tells you when it's enough.
And that's why Manson's message is so refreshing. He's not saying we shouldn't have goals or aspirations, but we need to be mindful of the why behind those pursuits.
It's like, are we chasing something that truly matters to us, or are we just trying to keep up with the Joneses?
Exactly. It's about defining our own version of success on our own terms.
So how do we do that? How do we break free from those external pressures and figure out what really matters to us?
Well, Manson talks about this crucial difference between fault and responsibility.
Fault and responsibility. Like, they're not the same thing.
Not quite. And to illustrate this, he gets really candid about his own struggles. He talks about his high school experience, his relationships, and how he had to learn to take responsibility for his actions, even when he wasn't entirely at fault for the situation.
It's like owning your part in things, even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. And he's not afraid to be vulnerable, to share his own mistakes and what he learned from them, which I think makes his message even more powerful.
Totally. It's like, hey, I've been there too. I've messed up. I'm still figuring things out.
Exactly. It's refreshing, isn't it? It makes him relatable, human.
Okay, so back to this fault versus responsibility thing.
Right. So we often confuse the two. We think that if we're not at fault, if something wasn't our intention, then we're off the hook.
But that's not always the case, is it?
Not at all. Because even when we're not to blame for something, we're still responsible for how we choose to respond.
It's like that saying, you can't always control what happens to you, but you can control how you react to it.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have agency, even in the face of difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy, right? It's much easier to play the blame game, to point fingers at others or external circumstances when things go wrong.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's way easier to be like, it's not my fault. It's their fault. It's the world's fault.
Right. But ultimately, that keeps us stuck. It prevents us from learning, growing, and moving forward.
So taking responsibility is about empowering ourselves, even when it's hard.
Exactly. It's about shifting our focus from who's to blame to what can I learn from this? How can I grow from this experience?
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we actually do that? How do we break free from that blame game and embrace responsibility, especially when it's painful?
That's where things get really interesting. Because Manson doesn't shy away from the tougher questions. He challenges this whole culture of what he calls victimhood chic.
Victimhood chic. What's that?
It's this tendency to, well, glamorize victimhood, to wear it like a badge of honor.
Oh, I see that everywhere these days. It's like everyone's competing to be the biggest victim, and it's honestly a bit disturbing.
It is, because it can drown out the voices of those who are genuinely suffering.
It's like crying wolf. If everyone's claiming victimhood all the time, it becomes harder to take legitimate claims seriously.
Exactly. And it creates this culture where people are encouraged to see themselves as powerless, defined by their misfortunes rather than their resilience.
So how do we break free from that mentality, both individually and as a society?
Manson argues that it starts with, you guessed it, taking ownership. It's about recognizing that we have agency, even in the face of difficult circumstances.
Okay, so more responsibility, less blame. Got
Mhm.
it. But how does that actually play out in real life?
Well, he uses this really interesting, albeit disturbing, example of a woman named Meredith who falsely accused her father of abuse.
Whoa, that's a heavy one. False accusations are incredibly serious.
They are. And while every case is unique, Manson uses Meredith's story to illustrate how our beliefs, even our memories, can be shaped by a complex web of factors.
Like how our past experiences, the information we consume, even the people we surround ourselves with, can influence our perceptions.
Precisely. And while Meredith's story is an extreme example, it highlights a crucial point that Manson emphasizes throughout the book. Certainty is the enemy of growth.
So it's better to embrace doubt.
In a sense, yes, doubt keeps us humble. It forces us to question our assumptions, to be open to new information, new perspectives.
It's like that saying, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing.
Exactly. When we cling too tightly to our beliefs, we close ourselves off to the possibility of being wrong.
And if we're never wrong, we never learn.
Precisely. Growth requires a willingness to be wrong, to change our minds. Which reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about learning to code.
Oh yeah, that whole coding fiasco. What about it?
Well, didn't you have a pretty clear vision of what you thought that journey would look like?
Yeah, totally. I was going to be this tech whiz creating the next big app, raking in the big bucks.
But then reality hit.
Reality hit hard. Turns out, coding wasn't exactly the glamorous, fulfilling career path I had built it up to be in my head.
And that's okay, because here's the thing. Sometimes we need those reality checks, those moments where our illusions are shattered, to redirect us towards something that truly resonates with us.
It was a tough pill to swallow at the time, but
Yeah.
looking back, I'm grateful for that experience. It forced me to confront my own illusions, reevaluate what I actually wanted.
And that's what Manson is getting at when he talks about the importance of failure. He argues that failure isn't the opposite of success, but rather a necessary part of it.
We're so conditioned to fear failure, to avoid it at all costs.
Right. But what if we embraced it as a learning opportunity, as a chance to course correct, to refine our direction?
It's like instead of beating ourselves up for our mistakes, we can ask ourselves, okay, what can I learn from this? How can I use this experience to make better choices moving forward?
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, Manson tells this incredible story about Lieutenant Onoda.
Lieutenant Onoda.
He was this Japanese soldier during World War II, and he was stationed on a remote island in the Philippines.
Okay.
And he was given these very explicit orders, never surrender, no matter what.
Wow, that's intense.
Right. So the war ends, right. But Onoda, he's cut off from the outside world, doesn't get the memo. He continues to fight.
For how long?
For almost 30 years.
30 years, seriously. He was out there fighting a war that was already over.
He was. He believed any news of Japan's defeat was enemy propaganda. It took a young adventurer who was kind of obsessed with Onoda's story to track him down in the jungle and convince him that the war was really, truly over.
That's wild. Talk about dedication. Or maybe delusion. I don't even know what to call it.
It's a fascinating case study in the power of belief, the complexities of commitment. On one hand, you have this incredible display of loyalty, perseverance.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind faith, the importance of questioning our beliefs, even when they're deeply held.
So how do we find that balance? When does dedication become destructive? Where's the line between commitment and delusion?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something Manson explores in the context of relationships as well.
Relationships? How so?
Well, he argues that healthy relationships like any worthwhile endeavor, require boundaries.
Boundaries, okay.
It's about being able to say no to things that don't serve us, even if it means potentially disappointing others.
Which can be really hard for some people, myself included.
Oh, absolutely. It takes practice.
Yeah.
But Manson argues that this ability to say no is crucial for our own well-being. It's about recognizing that we can't be everything to everyone.
We can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. And to drive this point home, he uses a rather unexpected example, Romeo and Juliet.
Wait, Romeo and Juliet, the Shakespearean tragedy, what do they have to do with boundaries?
Well, Manson points out how that classic love story, often held up as the epitome of romance, is actually a cautionary tale about the dangers of unhealthy boundaries.
It's like they're so blinded by their love, so caught up in their own little world, that they lose sight of everything else.
Exactly. And ultimately, it leads to their downfall. They become so enmeshed, so dependent on each other, that they can't exist independently.
That's kind of a dark way to look at it.
It is, but I think it's an important reminder that even in the name of love, boundaries are crucial. They allow us to maintain our sense of self, our individuality, within the context of a relationship.
It's about recognizing that we are separate individuals with our own needs and desires, even as we come together in a relationship.
Exactly. And that requires a certain level of maturity, of self-awareness, to be able to communicate those needs and respect the boundaries of others.
So how do we learn to set healthy boundaries?
Yeah.
Especially if we're not used to it. So much to unpack here. Values, responsibility, boundaries, learning to say no, it's a lot. But I'm curious, what's the ultimate takeaway here? What's the subtle art behind not giving a feck, really?
It's about recognizing, we only have so many fecks to give.
Right, limited supply.
Exactly. So we got to choose wisely, right? What deserves that energy, that attention?
It's about quality over quantity, not just with problems, but with everything.
Absolutely. Our time, our energy, even our possessions, like you said.
It's about letting go of the things that drain us, that hold us back from what truly matters.
And accepting that life, well, it's going to be messy sometimes.
It's full of curveballs, that's for sure.
Exactly. It's unpredictable, sometimes unfair, and I think there's a certain freedom in accepting that.
That almost sounds like what Bukowski was getting at, with the whole don't try thing.
Interesting connection. How so?
Well, it's not about giving up, but maybe more about surrendering to what is. Recognizing our limitations, our flaws, the fact that we're not going to be here forever.
You've hit on something really profound there, because ultimately, Manson's whole philosophy, it hinges on our awareness of death.
Yeah, he goes there in that last chapter.
He does, not in a morbid way, but as this guiding principle for living a more meaningful life in the time we have.
It makes you think about your legacy, What do you want to be remembered for? What impact do you want to have?
And that's where he brings in the work of Ernest Becker.
Ernest Becker.
Yeah, he was a cultural anthropologist, wrote about these things called immortality projects. Basically this idea that we all have this unconscious fear of death, this death terror, driving us to create things that will outlive us.
So like our legacy, the things we leave behind.
Exactly. Our kids, our work, our contributions to the world, we want to make our mark, leave something lasting.
Makes sense. We're hardwired to seek meaning, purpose, something bigger than ourselves.
Absolutely. But, and this is where Manson adds another layer, these immortality projects, they can be great, but they can also become a trap if we're not careful.
A trap? How so?
Well, we can get so caught up in building our legacies, in chasing some grand vision of success that we forget to actually live.
We become so fixated on the future that we miss out on the present moment.
Exactly. It's like we're so busy trying to outrun death that we forget to savor the life we have right now.
That's deep. So how do we find that balance? How do we honor that desire to leave a legacy without getting so caught up in it that we forget to actually live?
That's the million-dollar question. And I think for Manson, it comes back to choosing our values, choosing our problems, and focusing on what truly matters in the present moment. It's about finding meaning and purpose in the everyday.
In the simple things, the little joys, the connections we share with others.
Exactly. Because those moments, they're fleeting.
They are. I'm reminded of this time I was in South Africa hiking. I was standing on the edge of this massive cliff overlooking the ocean. It was breathtaking, but also terrifying.
Terrifying how?
Just this sheer drop, the wind whipping around me. I felt so small, so aware of my own mortality in that moment. It was like a punch to the gut, but also incredibly clarifying.
Wow, I can only imagine.
It made me realize how precious and fragile life is, and how important it is to make the most of every moment.
And that's what Manson is getting at, I think. That awareness of death, it can be scary, but it can also be incredibly motivating.
It puts things in perspective, helps us prioritize what really matters.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a feck, I think the question Manson leaves us with is, what good problems are you avoiding in your own life?
It's a call to action, isn't it?
Yeah.
A reminder that we have a choice. We can choose to play it safe, to avoid discomfort, stay stuck in our comfort zones.
Or we can choose to embrace the challenges that come with growth, with pursuing our values, with living a life that is true to ourselves.
Even if it means getting a little messy, making a few mistakes along the way.
Exactly, because ultimately, it's those experiences, those challenges, those moments where we're pushed outside of our comfort zones that shape us into who we are meant to be.
Well, there you have it. Our deep dive into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck. We hope this episode has given you some things to ponder, some tools to navigate those inevitable challenges.
And maybe even a little permission to not take it all so seriously.
Remember, it's your life, your journey, your fecks to give. Choose wisely.